Cool. So let's see. I guess this is the paper I'm supposed to be hyping today. Steph there's a lot of big words in there and theories in there, and Steph could probably do a better job of explaining it. But in the interest of building up the intended boxing match, I think, between me and Evan, this is the takeaway of it. So this is from Neuroskeptic, the blob, brain, iceberg, right? So that's a brain, there's a blob on top of it, and there's a lot below it. So yes, if I were to go maybe in a little bit more controversial terms to spark discussion, what we're kind of arguing in this paper is to move away from finding those blobs to looking at them, figuring out what they do and things like that, and going a little bit deeper. In particular, we kind of emphasize two things here, just modeling the complexity of brains, so really embracing that complexity and integrating across multiple levels. Certainly not the first to argue that, maybe not even the best to argue that. And I think if you actually read some of the papers and go through it, it's not really much of a difference than probably a lot of the others up here have. But to just kind of a couple of the paths we push forward as ways of not necessarily subsuming these kind of blob mapping techniques or whatever you want to call them, but to move forward, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but move forward with them. So in terms of modeling the kind of complexity of the brain, right, it's a little bit preaching to the choir, at least in this audience, right? I went to, probably like you, went to a bunch of different symposiums and things like that, right? Looking at higher order interactions, that was pretty good, it fits in there. Machine learning, of course, so maybe a little less theory driven, maybe a little bit more data driven to kind of discover things in the brain or brain behavior associations. Or even going back to kind of the more theory-driven, kind of with controllability and network science. So those are kind of the broad approaches we've argued as kind of next directions or directions that we're currently going in as a field. And then again, integrating against different levels. Highlight this one from one of my students, Maya Fostered, and despite that crazy title there, it's actually really just about integrating against multiple different areas, right? Different scales, multiple modalities, species, geography, kind of social context, and things like that. So those are the ways forward we kind of argued in this paper. And just highlight that from this session, there is actually going to be we already have a kind of preliminary draft as kind of moving forward in that direction. So if you want, feel free to check that out. Any feedback can be directed to Maya. All right, cool.
Evan?
Hey everybody, my name is Evan Gordon, and I just wanted to follow up a little bit from what Garreau was talking about. We've been thinking a lot for a long time about cortical areas as an organizational principle of the human cortex, of the mammalian cortex. And like Garreau said, we really think of cortical areas as these regions that are bounded by a sudden sharp change in one of the fact criteria. Not necessarily all of them, but at least one of them. And if we think, my perspective is that if we think about these cortical areas as rooted in these fact criteria, then fundamentally we have to think of them as anatomical features. They are obviously very functionally relevant, but that function is constrained by the anatomy. The fact that a cortical area, a section of cortex, has a very distinct internal structure, architectonics and myeloarchitectonics that are distinct from its neighbor implies that it has an internal structure that's optimized for a certain set of processing operations. It does these type of processing operations. It detects edges, it does featural detection, and its neighbors do something different. And and the fact that it has differences from its neighbors in its anatomical connectivity, in where it gets inputs from, where it sends outputs to, also implies that it's doing something fundamentally different. These different inputs, outputs are also constraining its function. And thinking about cortical areas in this way as being constrained by the underlying anatomy is, I think, important because the cool thing is that we can start identifying these cortical areas or things that look like these cortical areas using human neuroimaging. We can start looking for these sharp changes in some of the fact criteria, not really architectonics, but some of the others, we can see things that look like areal boundaries. I do a lot of connectivity work, and if we put a functional connectivity seed in the middle of the calcarine sulcus in Russ Poldrack's brain, we can see a connectivity pattern that really nicely outlines putative V1. This is exactly what V1 should look like, and if we move that connectivity seed just a little ventrally outside of the boundaries of the calcarine sulcus, we get something that looks exactly like ventral V2, having strong connectivity not directly to V1 but to dorsal V2. And we can use various approaches to say, okay, where did this transition happen? And we can draw a boundary that looks very much like what the boundary of V1 should look like, identifying the location of this sharp transition. And I think the really cool thing is that these sharp transitions aren't just in primary cortex. We can see these incredibly sharp transitions from one connectivity pattern to a completely different connectivity pattern all over the brain, including in prefrontal and highly association-ish areas. So that's awesome. Neuroimaging can give us cortical areas, right? The problem is that we have to be really careful about how we interpret these. We can see these abrupt changes in these neuroimaging measures, but that's not necessarily, we haven't necessarily found a cortical area. As much as we would love to say that, like, I found a thing, it's not necessarily a cortical area because there are a bunch of things that could cause the area-like observation we found to not truly represent the underlying anatomy. These areas should, because they are anatomical features, they should be state invariant, but our neuroimaging measures are not state invariant. We put somebody in a different task contrast and we can see a very different neuroimaging pattern. This does not suggest that the areas themselves, the underlying anatomy, is changing. A different state can change the recruitment of adjacent areas, but not their locations. A different state can change the way that information flows across areas, affecting our measures of functional connectivity, but not the underlying anatomical connectivity. A great example, again, in Russ Poldrack's brain is if Russ has his eyes closed, then we see a connectivity pattern that really nicely seems to trace the outline of V1. But if we have Russ keep his eyes open, then the connectivity pattern changes dramatically. Now we have connectivity from V1 into putative V2. This does not mean that the boundaries are erased or that the areas have changed, but this means that now information is flowing from V1 into V2 into higher level processing areas. And here's another example where we just have to be really careful. As Garreau said, many areas have an within area topography, and these topographical changes can also look like abrupt changes in our neuroimaging measures. If we run a connectivity seed down primary motor cortex, as we showed in our recent paper, you can see these very abrupt changes between the different topographic portions of M1. This doesn't mean that these are necessarily different architectonic areas. They have different functions. It's a topographical division within M1, but it's not necessarily a different area. Now, here's an open question I just want to throw out, which I have been thinking about a lot. I showed before that prefrontal cortex has a lot of these abrupt changes, these densely packed transitions. Are these different areas, or do some of these transitions represent a within areal topographical organization in prefrontal cortex? And if so, what is that organizational principle? You know, we think of topography as visuotopy or somatotopy. What would it, but you know, those obviously don't apply for prefrontal cortex. What would it be? Maybe it's like a concept topy or something like that, which I think this is just really cool. If we think about areas as being the organizational principle, I think it really helps us frame questions like, is there a concept topy that we are seeing as we move around in prefrontal cortex that we can't really get to without that framework?
Thanks. I think, Nicola, I think you're up next.